Hey everybody, welcome back to the Fired Up with CJ show. We are on part two of three segments talking to Charles Garfield, and we are talking about his book, Our Wisdom Years, Growing Older with Joy, Fulfillment, Resilience, and No Regrets. So welcome back, Charles.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, in the first segment, you said that as we get older, you talk to a whole bunch of, and how many people did you talk to when you were talking to folks?
Over 800 older people.
Wow, 800 older people, which you're defining as could be late 40s, 50s, all the way up to what age was in those 800 people?
The oldest people were over 100.
Wow. Okay.
The fastest growing segment in our population, the fastest growing segment are centenarians, people over 100.
Wow.
Not the
Okay.
largest, obviously, but it's the fastest growing.
Wow, that's fascinating because so you surveyed or had conversations with.
Surveyed and had conversations with.
Okay, got it.
Some were just surveys, some were direct face to face conversations.
Okay. So were curious about, you felt yourself that some of your motivation of getting ahead, which you had in your early years, had been shifting. And one of the things that you found is that people really had desire to be of service and impacting people. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you found and how it shifted you in writing?
Well, I was amazed at how many people turned toward voluntarism.
Hmm.
Toward, they had developed skills over a lifetime, the kind of skills you've developed or I've developed earlier in life.
Mm.
And now that they weren't working in the same way, they may have retired or they may only be semi retired. They decided that they wanted to offer those skills to volunteer groups that were doing good work that they really cared about. And so they searched for those kinds of groups. They made themselves available. It's amazing how many volunteer groups there are in the country. In fact, I would say one of the most amazing statistics that I heard, it was an observation actually, that without the volunteer component in our country, we couldn't do the service sector. In other words, doctors, nurses, teachers, and other professionals can't do it all without the volunteer contribution. So there are so many volunteer organizations that could use the help that many of us who are of a certain age can offer them.
Mm.
And
And,
people turn in that direction.
So I've heard of, so I have a dear friend who's a psychotherapist, and she chose not to volunteer. She's in her 80s, and she chose not to volunteer necessarily doing psychotherapy, but she wants to do art, and she would like to do, like she volunteered at the library, where I think she basically does psychotherapy because she's so full of love that people come to her and talk to her and share their stories. Even though she's not a quote unquote therapist, people come as she's putting the books back and she's made dear friends that way. So, what did you find in terms of, if you were a lawyer, do you see people volunteering as a lawyer, or what did you see as various possibilities of volunteering and what people did?
Some people use the skills that they developed in their primary career, like your friend, the psychotherapist. She's using some of those skills, maybe not as a psychotherapist, but as a counselor, kind of informal peer counselor.
Hmm.
Other people turn to the hobbies that they had developed during their lifetime, the hobbies that never got enough attention. I'll give you a great example. When my father retired, um, he went back to a love of his that he had had his entire life. My parents had met in an acting class, and my father was the lead man in a whole series of plays. He wanted to be an actor, but it was during the Depression. It wasn't a good time. You couldn't make a living very easily. So he went into sales. For 40 years, he was a salesman. Within weeks of his retirement, he joined an acting troupe. He started acting again after all of those years. He became a leading man in a series of plays later on in his life, and he loved it. Go back to those things that are incomplete in your life that you
Mm,
tried that
mm,
didn't turn out to be your primary career, but might have been hobbies of yours. And ask yourself the question, how might I develop this farther? How
mm,
might this become a source of contribution in a volunteer sense, a a source of contribution to many people.
Mm. They always say, the it's all about talent, treasure, or I can't remember the other T, talent or treasure that you bring. And, you know, I think it's always really hard because maybe you have money and that's how you would like to give. Perhaps what you really want to do is teach kids. And it's not about giving money. It's like getting rolling up your sleeves and like, not doing a family foundation, although that's wonderful. But how do you bridge that? Because I think even when we get older, there's this like, oh, I'm supposed to give money. I'm not supposed to do the thing that I love doing, which or things that I don't even know how to do. So in your case, your father did acting, which he knew he liked. But how about for people who never developed hobbies? They never knew what their hobbies were. They defined their lives solely through work. So they haven't even given themselves a freedom to do that. How does one start pursuing that?
I write a lot about that in the book, in our
Mhm.
wisdom. I write a lot about how to experiment, how to explore. What a wonderful time. You have more time than you ever had before to explore, to do things that might be interesting to you. You might think of art. You might think of, as my father did, acting. You might think of contributing your skills as a counselor. Even if you've never been a counselor before, you have enough wisdom acquired over a lifetime to provide uh, support to all sorts of people who may
Mm.
be struggling. My mother, when she retired, decided that she wanted to teach English as a second language to people. So she taught English to people who were struggling, who had just come to this country and were struggling with the language. And she was great at it. That's not what she did for her entire life, but she decided in her exploration, she tried various things, and that was the thing that really stuck.
And how do you overcome? So I'm taking a class it's a shamanistic class, and we're talking about what your purpose is, and I'm actually very surprised to see most of the people are 50 and over. I would have thought it would be younger, but it's 50 and over, and people are exploring their purpose, and sometimes their soul, how I would describe it from a shamanic standpoint, not that I'm a shaman, but it's their soul is yearning to finally express what it was meant to come forth and do in this world. And a lot of people in this class have that kind of pull. And how do you balance that with, okay, maybe you're supposed to be a teacher and you haven't had any experience, and all the, well, I can't do that. Am I going to go really back to school? Oh my, there's a whole litany of no's, no, I can't, and fear that comes in that I'm too old to do this. Who am I to be a teacher when there's so many qualified teachers out there? This is an example of what I would imagine someone would say in that case. And what would you say in response to that kind of mindset?
Let the phrase "yes, I can" replace the phrase "no, I can't." What if you had talents that you never developed, that you're doubting because they're unfamiliar? But what if you could have developed, what if you still can develop them at a very high level of contribution? One of the things I heard in interviewing older people is they kept saying, I started out, I was kind of insecure and trying something new. But when I tried it, I realized I had some talent. I actually was good at it. I could
Mm,
learn to do it.
mm,
Learning is part of the fun, part of the process.
mm,
Don't talk yourself out of your best ideas. One of the saddest things when people get very old is when they say that they talk themselves out of their best ideas.
mm, mm. So
Don't talk
give
yourself out of the best.
all right, give us some examples of some of how people like maybe can you share some vignettes or stories of people who when you had these one-on-one conversations, I think the very common refrain is, I'm too old to do that. No one's going to want an old person like me. I literally have heard this in this workshop that I've been taking. So what can you give some story or vignette about someone who may have came in that way and changed their mind and what happened to give them the confidence to change their mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's a story about my mother because she and my dad were wonderful role models. They were part of the motivation for writing the book because of all I learned from them. My mother always wanted to be a writer. She saw that I wrote books. She saw other people wrote books, friends of mine, friends of hers, in fact. But she doubted her ability to do it. I finally talked her into writing children's books because
Mm,
she was a natural with kids. And she started writing. I said, just write. You don't have to worry about publication. You don't have to worry about how wonderful it is. You can always get somebody to edit it. Just write what's in your heart. Just write stories that really moved you, stories from your life or stories from your imagination.
mm,
Well, guess what happened? By the time she got to her 90s, she had written 4 books, 4 children's books. All of them got published. All of them were good books, solid books. And I asked her, what's the enduring lesson that you can teach other older people from your experience writing books? She said, give it a try, give it a chance. The saddest thing would have been if I never tried.
mm, mm. So it goes back to living with no regrets. I mean, if this is something that her soul wanted, which it sounded like she intuitively sensed that that was the case, and she finally had the courage to step forward and just try. And I think the key thing that you described is very hard for we started off by talking about a productivity mindset. So, if I write a book, it has to be a New York Times bestseller. What if the book doesn't sell any copies? Why am I writing if there is no purpose for it, Charles? Like, why, if there's no achievement component, why even bother writing the book if it's not going to be published? And what would you say to that?
What I would say is what I said to my mother: we can always get it on Amazon. We can always get it listed somewhere. You can always give it to your friends as a gift. You can give your books, your copies of your books to anybody you care to. Forget about the New York Times bestseller list. Forget about it being a success in the traditional ways that you would have thought about earlier in life. Have a treasure. Have a treasure that you can give to the close people. Imagine if the success of your book is due not to how many copies it sells in the world, but how many copies you give to people you care about most. You,
Hmm.
you run into somebody who has kids, you've written some children's books, give them copies of your books for their grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
She started doing that, and it was tremendously enlivening for her. She loved it. She loved being able to give presents to people, specifically copies of her books.
Hmm. So it's not, and I think that that's one of the reasons why. I mean, right now when we are a writer, puts a lot of pressure that it has to have like, why bother? It has to have a certain number in order to get published. You have to get a publisher. If you can't get a publisher, it's like this whole process, right? So, so I love the idea of self-publishing and don't worry about whether because I wonder if when she didn't worry about that and she just expressed her soul and it had impact on the people she loved, did she feel like it was enough?
Absolutely. When you nurture people you love most, that's the most delicious pleasure of all. That's
Hmm.
the most wonderful pleasure of all. Would you rather sell 100,000 copies of a book? I say this to an older person. Would you rather sell 100,000 copies of your book or get 100 copies into exactly the right hands, the people you care about most in the world? Younger people will say, I want the 100,000. Older people are not so sure. Older people start talking about, no, I'd rather get my work as a kind of legacy project into the hands of people I care about most. I want them to know, I want the people who are closest to me to know who I am, what I care about, and to gift them my insight and wisdom.
Wow, so that's what you were saying is that this is my legacy. If I pass, this is my, so to speak, tombstone written by me of what I want to say about my life, and that is enough. That's an expression of who you are and giving it as a gift so that that book is just out there someplace.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hmm. Wow. Okay. Very interesting. All right. So, in the next segment, I want to talk about creativity and putting your best self out there. We've been talking to Charles Garfield about his book, um, Our Wisdom Years, Growing Older with Joy, Fulfillment, Resilience, and No Regrets. Thank you so much.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show, and would love your support in any way by giving me comments below, or to subscribe to the show, or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.